Unit 7. Our study of the Great War, or World War I, will be the beginning of Unit 7, World Wars and Modern America, 1900s to 1930s. It's impossible to separate American history from world history. George Washington instructed politicians to avoid foreign entanglements, and they tried and tried. The beginning of the 20th century put an end to that. It was hard to hide on the other side of an ocean. The United States affected and was affected by the rest of the world. As you read, be sure that you know the words in blue as you go through the text. Notice, too, that as the U.S. expanded, and its expanded influence went to other parts of the world, we became more connected and our relationships more complicated. Chapter 32, The Great War. What they were fighting about. The exact cause of World War I, initially called the Great War, is hard to pinpoint. Peace in Europe was so fragile that anything could have set it off. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark from these things: militaries, imperialism, nationalism, and alliances. Make sure you go back and know what was happening with each one of these. Pay particular attention to the alliances. The Triple Alliance was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. The Triple Entente, meaning understanding or agreement, was France, Britain, and Russia. To remember the main reasons for World War I, use this mnemonic. Main: militaries, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Now let's talk about the spark that started it. Millions of Slavic people who lived under the Austro-Hungarian Empire wanted to become part of Serbia. On June 28th of 1914, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo. A month later, on July 28, 1914, Austria declared war on Serbia. Alliances, or agreements. What happened next is that people defended their allies. Germany was an Austro-Hungarian ally. They declared war on Russia. Russia supported Serbia. Germany also declared war on France, a Russian ally. When Germany invaded Belgium, a neutral country between Germany and France, Britain, an ally of France and Belgium, declared war on Germany. By early August of 1914, a full-scale war had developed in Europe. The two sides were, they now have a new name, the Central Powers, which included Austria-Hungary, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, which is right down here, it's basically Turkey, and Bulgaria. Right there. The Allied powers, or allies, which were the Triple Entente, include Serbia, Russia, France, Great Britain, and later Japan and Italy. This is a side that the United States will ultimately join. Take a second or two to take a look at the map of Europe. That's how it was in 1914. The green countries were the ones that belonged to the Allied powers, and the orange ones are the ones that belong to the Central Powers. American neutrality. President Wilson was determined to follow George Washington's advice to steer clear of foreign conflicts, and America planned to continue trading with both the Allies and the Central Powers. Meanwhile, the war is going on in Europe. The First Battle of the Marne. Germany was fighting a war on two fronts, Russia in the east and France and England in the west. Russia in the east, France and England in the west. The Germans tried to advance into France to knock France out of the war quickly so that they could focus on Russia. However, the small Belgian army held them off for nearly 3 weeks, giving France and Britain time to prepare for war. The French and British stopped the Germans at the Marne River near Paris and declared victory in the First Battle of the Marne. That was September 6th through 12th of 1914. Trench warfare. The First Battle of the Marne proved that neither side would have an easy victory. The armies used a new style of fighting, trench warfare. Soldiers stayed in dugout trenches for long stretches of time, with no man's land in between them. Soldiers would sometimes fire at one another, but there were very few gains for either side, causing a stalemate. A stalemate is a situation in which neither side can win. This drawing at the top of the page shows us a little bit more about trench warfare. We have one side over here, then we have the other side. There's that no man's land in the middle. There's barbed wire in between. Then we have a frontline trench, a support trench, and then a reserve trench. Notice the little guys in there? And the artillery behind them. The guns that are too big to carry, things like cannons and rocket launchers. In 1916, Allied and Central Powers tried to end the impasse on the Western Front. In February, the Germans incited the Battle of Verdun. In July, the Allies instigated the Battle of the Somme. The battles caused many casualties. More new ways of fighting, besides trench warfare. Modern weapons caused far more casualties at a faster rate than ever before. The slaughter on the battlefields led to despair and the destruction of an entire generation of men. Notice some of these new ways of fighting. Machine guns and artillery, cannons, rocket launchers, poison gases, submarines, also called U-boats, and armored tanks. The British were actually the first ones to use those in 1916, and the use of airplanes in war. Pilots who shot down enemy planes were called aces. The most famous German ace was Manfred von Richthofen. He was really called the Red Baron by everybody else. And the most famous American ace was Eddie Rickenbacker. The Lusitania. Naval warfare also changed. The Allies blocked off German ports. The Germans retaliated by targeting Allied ships with submarines called Unterseeboots, or U-boats, undersea boats. On May 7th of 1915, a U-boat sank the British ship Lusitania, killing 1,000 people, including over 100 Americans. There were ammunitions and unlawful goods in the cargo, but the Lusitania was a passenger ship, and the civilian deaths seemed inhumane. Still, determined to remain neutral, Wilson convinced Germany to make the Sussex Pledge, which was named after another ship that was torpedoed by U-boats, and promised not to target ships that didn't carry weapons. We're in 1916. The war had cost the lives of millions of Europeans, and Wilson was re-elected president on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." The next year, following the Sussex Pledge, the Germans went back to attacking all Allied ships, using a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. They intended to cut off the British Isles from the supplies, forcing an end to the war before American intervention. And it almost worked. The Zimmermann Note. In early 1917, British intelligence intercepted a telegram from a German official named Arthur Zimmermann. The Zimmermann Note, as it's now called, proposed an alliance between Germany and Mexico against the United States. In exchange, Germany would help Mexico get back Texas and other lost territories. Thankfully, Mexico declined, but the telegram was published by American newspapers, and anti-German sentiment boiled over. On April 2, 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war. And after 3 days of debate, the U.S. entered the Great War. Remember that they didn't know there'd be a World War II yet, so nobody called it World War I. Convoy. The U.S. helped by the Allies. Convoy. The U.S. helped the Allies by introducing the convoy system, which was sending ships across the Atlantic accompanied by warships to protect them from the U-boat attacks. Over there, the American Expeditionary Forces. The question we should think about is, what was the impact of the U.S. arrival? When the American Army, called the American Expeditionary Forces, led by General John Pershing, arrived in France, it provided an influx of energy to the Allies. French and British troops were exhausted and running out of supplies, but we gave them new energy. Ready to fight. Even with a large number of volunteers, including women and African Americans, the U.S. military wasn't ready to handle such a big war. In May of 1917, the Selective Service Act started a draft for all men between the ages of 21 and 30. That meant they were supposed to go fight for our country. Black draftees were segregated from whites in the American forces, but some did go and fight with the French army, which was less discriminatory. Some of these African Americans were awarded the French Cross de Guerre, the Cross of War, a medal for their bravery. The U.S. government got supplies and funding by selling Liberty bonds, which basically means individual citizens lent money to the government. Other things that helped the United States. We set up the War Industries Board to manage the distribution and production of supplies. And then the National War Labor Board was set up to settle conflicts with unions without strikes. Another thing we did was urging people to save resources through the Fuel Administration and food through the Food Administration. We also encouraged citizens to plant victory gardens so that a higher percentage of the food from the larger farms could go to the soldiers. The U.S. had to work hard to produce enough food and supplies for its own army and its allies. Why did we have to help the Allies, too? We'll answer that question later. The home front. The U.S. government had to deal with a labor shortage, with young men away fighting, women, immigrants, and African Americans got access to jobs they couldn't get before. Public opinion, another thing they had to deal with. The Committee on Public Information was created to deal with this. They created propaganda about German atrocities, the horrible things the Germans did to keep the American people riled up. And it worked. But it also encouraged anti-German American discrimination. Limiting criticism. President Wilson signed into law the Espionage Act, which included specific penalties for spies. And he also enacted the Sedition Act, making it illegal to express negative thoughts about the government. Many pacifists, people who wanted peace, and socialists were jailed because of this, including Eugene V. Debs. In 1919, the Supreme Court case of Schneck versus the United States, the court ruled that limitations on free speech were valid in a time of war. The Sedition Act was passed during World War I. The Alien and Sedition Acts were passed in 1798. Both of them made sedition, or going against the government, illegal. 14 points. On January 8, 1918, well before the war ended, President Wilson justified why the U.S. was going to war and gave a set of specific goals. He also informed Congress that this was, quote, the war to end all wars, and he had made a plan to prevent another major war. The plan became known as the 14 Points. Here they are. No secret treaties and alliances, freedom of navigation on the seas, equality of trade, smaller militaries, an adjustment of colonial claims, the evacuation and restoration of the Russian territory, the evacuation and restoration of Belgian territory, the evacuation and restoration of French territory, the evacuation of the German armies, a readjustment of the Italian borders, an autonomy for the people of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, giving them their own self-governance, the evacuation and restoration of the Balkan Peninsula, Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, autonomy for the Ottoman Empire, and the establishment of an independent Poland, and, last but not least, a League of Nations, an organization of countries working together to resolve disputes. Meanwhile, the Russian Revolution. The Russians had taken huge casualties, and the country was struggling. In March of 1917, the Russian Revolution began. Tsar Nicholas II, the ruler of Russia, was forced to step down. The interim, or new, democratic government that replaced him failed to help with the food shortages and the low morale. Then, in November of 1917, a group called the Bolsheviks came to power. They were led by Vladimir Lenin. They seized power and set up a communist government. Lenin promised land, peace, bread. It was a powerful message, and it hit home for the war-weary people of Russia. Russia was stretched too thin. It signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, I don't know how to say it anyway, with Germany in March of 1918 to get out of the war. The treaty forced Russia to cede or give much of its territory to Germany. Germany then was certain that the war would end soon. The Second Battle of the Marne. On March 21 of 1918, in the spring offensive, Germans marched nearly all the way to Paris, hoping to end the war before the rest of the American forces arrived. In May and June of 1918, American forces stopped them at the battles of Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood. In July, the spring offensive ended with a turning point battle, the Second Battle of the Marne. The Germans lost territory that they had gained earlier that spring, and the Allies went on the offensive. The Battle of the Argonne Forest. That September, the Allies continued to push the Germans back towards Germany. The AEF, the American Army, defeated them at the Battle of Saint-Michel, and then joined Allied troops for the Battle of the Argonne Forest on September 26 of 1918. Both sides took massive losses. Armistice. Germany had underestimated the American forces. Its navy, Germany's navy, was close to mutiny, and the Central Powers were falling apart. Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire had withdrawn from the war in early fall of 1918, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire soon after that. Parts of these empires, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, declared themselves independent nations, and Germany was experiencing a severe food shortage. On November 9, 1918, the German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II stepped down. The new government of Germany agreed to President Wilson's terms for armistice. The ceasefire became official at 11 a.m. on November 11th of 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The cost of war. The war had ravaged Europe and devastated an entire generation of European men. Historians' best guess is that 37 million were killed or wounded in 4 years of fighting. With no working farms or factories, the European economy was devastated as well. And a flu pandemic or outbreak in 1918 killed more people than had died during the war. The world was ready for peace. The Treaty of Versailles. In 1919, the Big Four, President Wilson, the Prime Minister of England, the Premier of France, and the Prime Minister of Italy, met at Versailles, near Paris. No Central Powers leaders were invited. Wilson wanted to end the war with minimal animosity. The European nations wanted Germany to take full blame, lose its colonies, lose its militaries, and pay for reparations or financial compensations to the people who had been impacted. On June 28th of 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, the Allies in Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles. It harshly punished Germany. It split up the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires and established the League of Nations. The treaty radically redrew the boundaries of Europe and the Middle East. The goal was to solve ethnic divisions, but the treaty actually led to more conflicts, and it is still a source of tension in the Middle East, where countries were literally created by drawing lines in the sand. The treaty did overlap with some of Wilson's 14 points, but not all. Wilson returned to the U.S. and campaigned for the Treaty of Versailles, but Congress rejected it. They worried that the League of Nations would rob Congress of power by deciding when and where the American military would fight. Although Wilson had come up with the idea of the League of Nations, the U.S. never joined. Americans wanted to return to isolationism. Note that Wilson did suffer a massive stroke while he was out trying to get support for the League of Nations. And the definition of isolationism again. Before you go on, come over to the right side of the page, read the questions, and see if you know the answers. When you think you're ready, move to the next slide and check to see if you were right.